In this video, we consider risk communication, preparedness, and planning. We'll be considering 4 topics. First, preparedness and pre-crisis planning. Second, the risk communication team roles, responsibilities, and responses. Third, we'll focus on key audiences, the public, partners, and stakeholders. And fourth, the first 48 hours of crisis communication. Here are the things I'd like you to be able to do at the end of this little lecture. You should be able to outline the main components of a risk communication plan, begin an organizational audit to assess the rapid response capabilities of your organization during a crisis, and you'll be able to describe the individual roles and responsibilities of each risk communication team member before, during, and following a crisis. You should be able to begin to create strategies to expand external networks and build partnerships with key audiences, and hopefully you can describe the strategies and resources needed to be first, to be right, and be credible during the first 48 hours of a crisis. Our first topic is the pre-crisis planning that's essential to preparedness. The problem with preparedness is there's no time for it. So would you rather plan when your environment is high stress and everyone is emotional, when the staff is feeling overwhelmed, tired, and prone to meltdowns? You're going to be working in a situation that's full of unknowns while the public and media are demanding information now. You're going to be making decisions without having all the information that you want, and the leaders are not going to be available to approve this. These are some of the reasons why it's better to plan and be prepared than to find yourself in one or more of these situations. If you're going to be first, be right, and be credible, it's going to take a risk communication plan. Here's a little exercise for you. I'm going to ask you to think about 3 key messages for each of these 3 components of this CDC motto. So for example, to be first, you might consider that preparedness is necessary to be first. Don't wait until all the answers are known. And third, discuss what you know, don't know, and what you're doing about it. So I'll spot you those 3. Now see if you can come up with 3 more for being right and being credible. A risk communication plan is more than an emergency response plan. There are 4 stages to a crisis. There's the pre-crisis stage, and that's when we can take action right now. We can begin to prepare. Then there's the initial phase of the crisis. This is the critical first 48 hours when the crisis is hitting. This is followed by the maintenance stage. This is where you're expanding on the response that you began in the first 48 hours. And then there is the resolution, where you're focusing more on recovering from the crisis and evaluating your performance during it. A risk communication plan includes planning and action before, during, and after a crisis. For example, during the pre-crisis phase, this is not just planning, it includes taking action, for example, networking, and going out and listening to publics. The initial phase of response, this is where you have to consider what's it going to take to be first, to be right, and to be credible. During the maintenance phase, you need to maintain communication within your organization, with partners and networks, and with the publics. And then finally, during the resolution phase, you have to have some criteria to evaluate your performance and figure out how your plan will be modified. Remember that earlier we said risk communication is multidirectional, and it involves the audience as an information source. Here are some components of the risk communication process. There needs to be audience assessment, audience involvement. You have to pay attention to crafting the message, to the logistics of your communication, meta-messaging, listening, self-assessment, and evaluation. So here's a little task I'd like you to spend a moment on. Think about which of these components are things that you can do before the crisis, and which of these components are things that you would do after the crisis. Here are some pre-event activities you can do to prepare for a crisis. You can involve key audiences, identify your public's partners, stakeholders, and spend some time speaking with them, communicating with them. It's a time for relationship building, especially with the media. You can develop messages and test them long before you're going to need them, and this is a time to train and practice with your staff. In the homework exercise for this module, you'll see some of the components of a risk communication plan that includes such things as identifying the risk communication team, conducting an organizational audit or assessment, looking at your goals and strategies, identifying key audiences among the public, your partners, and stakeholders. Risk communication goals are going to be important to identify in this plan. You'll pay attention to resources, developing messages and vehicles for delivering these messages. Media relations will be important during a crisis. Your emergency response, the post-event recovery and evaluation process are all going to be part of a risk communication plan. Let's drill down to some of the key features of the plan. The organizational audit is where you address relationship building, working on trust and credibility, your transparency and openness. The risk communication team is going to require equal emphasis on planning and the response. When we look at key audiences, your strategy is going to be to learn how to listen to the audience and to factor in the emotional response to the event that these different audiences are going to have. You're going to need pre- and post-event risk communication goals as well as emergency response goals. When it comes to media relations, you'll have to develop working relationships with the press prior to an event. For the emergency response, remember our 3 rules. Be first, be right, and be credible. During recovery and evaluation, this is the time to involve key audiences in the evaluation process. Completing the risk communication plan is just the beginning. Consider it a living document that's integral to your organization's standard operating procedure. This is the time that you would launch a series of pre-crisis activities to build relationships, to build trust, to build partnerships. The plan needs to be evaluated and updated regularly. Personnel are going to change. Contact information is going to change. The plan should be shared with partners and stakeholders, and it requires ongoing monitoring with new and revised messages as conditions change, and new and revised vehicles as technology continues to evolve the way that we communicate with one another. Most of all, it's going to require ongoing training, drills, tabletop exercises to make sure that people know what they need to know when the time comes. One of your homework assignments for this module is going to be to begin your risk communication plan. I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention to identifying risk communication goals and strategies for your organization. Then I'm going to ask you to fill out other pieces of the plan. You don't have to use this particular plan template. It's offered as an example of what a risk communication plan could look like. But if you're going to be involved in risk communication, you're going to need a plan. Our second topic is the risk communication team, the roles, responsibilities, and responses found on that team. Risk communication teams expand the data pool and experiences available to us, and they help us to overcome personal biases. Effective teams result in better quality decisions and acceptance and implementation by those participating in the decision. The purpose of a risk communication team is threefold. It provides for broad input to identify issues. They develop and maintain trust-based relationships, and they create effective communication plans and processes. Let's consider the responsibilities of the team members now. In pre-crisis communication, assessment, and planning, the job is to design and conduct the organization audit. In relationship building, team members network and collaborate on projects. They work with advisory groups, attend professional meetings. They would establish two-way communication mechanisms and share information with key publics. It's also their job to educate and brief the media on the emerging issues. When we're looking at monitoring the emerging issues, team members listen to the publics. They would devise precaution advocacy, outrage management strategies. They would share information with their partners. Then there's the selection and preparation of spokespersons. The team conducts risk communication training as well as media training, and they provide practice opportunities. Finally, when we talk about testing, practicing, evaluating, modifying, and updating, the team would test messages with key audiences. They would keep fact sheets and response documents updated. They listen and they learn from the key audiences. Now let's consider the team responsibilities during those first 48 hours. And by the way, I'm going to discuss this further later in the module. But they would begin by verifying the situation. Then they conduct notifications, assess the level of crisis, issue assignments, and then prepare information and obtain any necessary approvals. Next are the response maintenance responsibilities of the team members, a subject to which we'll also return later in this module. The team has to release information to the public and remain accessible to the media. They need to communicate and coordinate with their external partners and networks, monitor, maintain, and make adjustments for the remaining life of the crisis. They also need to revise and update the messages and keep the information fresh. Risk communication team responsibilities during the post-event recovery operations include determining if the goals were met. It requires listening to the public, revising and updating messages, coordinating with partners and stakeholders, and conducting public education as needed. Part of your homework assignment is going to require you to identify risk communication team members and roles for the organization, as well as contact information. You may be tempted to go over this quickly or just to identify people such as Public Affairs Office. I would encourage you to put names to this and to go to the effort to find the contact information. This is one of the most valuable things that you'll do in a risk communication plan. Our third topic is key audiences, our publics, partners, and stakeholders. Let's consider just who these three key audiences are. We begin with the publics, and notice the S. There's an unlimited subset of publics. They vary by education, knowledge of the event or issue, by their age, their language, cultural orientation, and even their geography. Keep in mind, employees are often an overlooked public. They need to be included in the plan. They may have both personal and professional stakes in the issue. Partners can be formal or informal relationships, and stakeholders are groups or individuals who have influence or are involved in the decision-making process. There can be overlap and intersection among key audiences. Some individuals will belong to more than one group. But if we think about how we're going to listen to these publics, we begin by reviewing telephone logs, who's been calling the office, email inquiries, internet hits, letters received, things like that. Focus groups can help you figure out who your audiences are. You can do surveys, you can form and listen to advisory groups, or attend community forums. There are all sorts of ways to listen to publics. There are many audiences in a crisis, and in your homework assignment, you're going to be asked to identify some primary and secondary audiences. At the center of the crisis, we find first responders and victims. Public health and medical care are key here. So you want to be developing action messages and exhibiting concern for the safety of people in these audience groups. The next ring of concern would be the public immediately outside the affected area, media, family members and friends of the victims, and the responders. There's no immediate action required by these people, but they're going to be concerned for safety and they're going to want facts. And in the third circle, you have the international, the national interest, trade and industry groups that might be affected, elected officials. These people are going to be concerned for the safety of the folks, and they're going to want to look for and hear about reassurances that the situation is being appropriately handled. The National Council for Food Protection and Defense did some research on underrepresented communities, specifically Native and New Americans, and they found out there was a great deal of value to multicultural research teams. So make sure that your research teams look like the people you're researching. Building relationships can take time. There are proprietary issues that you need to communicate carefully with the affected groups about. They want to understand how research is going to benefit the community, and remember that religion and culture can be extremely important to some of these underrepresented communities. This research showed that people are more likely to pay attention and react to a crisis event that's closest to their family and their personal interest. The preferred crisis messages were simple and answered the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. Messages that offered self-efficacy steps were also preferred. A credible spokesperson is preferably from the community, or pair an agency spokesperson with a respected person from the cultural community. Stakeholders are defined as groups or individuals who have influence or are involved in the decision-making process. And stakeholder theory supports the need to look beyond the organization's members for stakeholders and expand critical relationships to include other groups from the community, from industry, and from government. Why do we practice stakeholder relations? Very simply because they may know what you need to know. And they can provide external points of view and diverse opinions. So listening to their perspective will increase their buy-in, and as a result, it increases the credibility of your key messages. So query stakeholders to establish their interest in the issue at hand. Find common ground between your organization and all of your partners. Here are 2 important reasons to take good care of stakeholders. Stakeholders with a vested interest in the success of the organization are likely to be supportive during a crisis. And stakeholders that are not involved are more likely to withdraw organizational support in the face of a crisis. In an outbreak of foodborne illness, community stakeholders can include healthcare organizations like hospitals, clinics, health plans, professional associations. It can include preparedness organizations like the Red Cross, or advocacy and neighborhood organizations, cultural agents, and other NGOs. Consumer and watchdog groups, lobbyists, all of these may be among the community's stakeholders. For that foodborne outbreak, government stakeholders can be found at the municipal or county level. They would include food inspectors, public health officials, first responders, and law enforcement. There may be some at the state level in the Department of Health, Agriculture, Environment, Transportation, Public Safety, and at the federal level, the Department of Homeland Security, the Centers for Disease Control, Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture's Food Safety Inspection Service, and maybe even the FBI. Elected officials, school and other educational institutions, and extension specialists could be among the many government stakeholders. For a foodborne illness outbreak, industry stakeholders could include growers, producers, processors, transportation, and retail partners. Business and trade associations are going to be interested. Unions and co-ops could be affected, and industry lobbyists and consultants may be among your industry stakeholders. Subject matter experts will come from research institutions the community, government, and industry. They would include people like epidemiologists, risk assessment experts, academics, health educators, risk communication experts. They would provide independent, credible statements, facts, images, and other resources that could be used during the crisis. They present scientific data, statistics, up-to-date knowledge, and background information to help support risk communication. There are a number of common mistakes in stakeholder relations that you need to avoid. First is inadequate access when they can't reach you. Second is deafness when you don't listen to their concerns. Third is impersonality when you cannot empathize with their concerns. Fourth is the perception of arrogance when their input is not valued or when you speak in jargon that the public can't understand. Lack of clarity is a common problem. Again, it might be the jargon that they don't understand. We're dealing with difficult topics at times during times of high stress, so simplify your language. And then there's just dullness, the lack of energy for response to our stakeholder partners. The list of mistakes goes on. It includes timeliness when you provide too little information too late, or if you minimize the negative by emphasizing factors that would inspire trust that's not founded by the circumstances. We might fail to identify relevant stakeholders or fail to ask them for their opinions or fail to provide them with information. And finally, being perceived as an advocate who's marketing to them rather than talking with them. So these are among the mistakes that you want to avoid when dealing with your partners and stakeholders. Your homework assignment is going to ask you to identify your organization's key audiences. Give that some careful thought. Our fourth and final topic is crisis communication during the first 48 hours. Being prepared means knowing the concepts and having the skills. Rapid response during the first 48 hours of a crisis involves more than a series of checklists, contact lists, and procedures. So don't overlook your key audience's reactions and their needs in a crisis. This is going to require effective crisis communication. During the first 48 hours of a crisis, you are responding to high hazard and high outrage. So acknowledge the hazard, validate people's concern, and give them ways to act. Fear is our natural reaction in a crisis. It's automatic, it comes early, and it's temporary. It may entail a small overreaction, so it could require some guidance, but it helps us to rehearse and to be ready to act when action is required. It also reduces later overreactions. So fear is a useful response. Let it happen. Overreaction is our initial reaction to a new, potentially serious risk. We learn of the risk, we pause, we become hypervigilant, we personalize the risk and figure out how it can affect us, and then we take extra precautions that are probably unnecessary, or at least are premature. Here's another message you've heard before, repeated for its relevance. Trust factors in high-stress situations tend to be a person's ability to listen, care, and express empathy. Their honesty and openness count more than their competence and expertise. So when you are in a high-stress situation, carefully choose your messenger. Consider some of the components of the basic communication model during a high-stress situation. The sender must be perceived to be trustworthy and credible. The receiver, meanwhile, has a reduced ability to process complex information, so the message needs to be simplified. Feedback is important to consider. What is the receiver hearing? What is the receiver feeling? There's a lot of mental noise during high-stress situations. It's harder to hear, harder to understand, and harder to remember. Keep these things in mind as you plan your messages. Let me repeat some of these facts about how communication has to shift from low stress situations to high stress situations. In low stress, people can process an average of 7 messages. In high stress, it's 3 messages. In low stress, people process information in the order in which it's given, 1, 2, 3. During high stress situations, people process information in primacy order. They remember what they think was most important. Or recency order. They remember the last thing that you said. So it would be more of a 3, 2, 1 order. Information can be processed at the average grade level during low stress, but during high stress, you should subtract 4 grade levels from that average grade. During low stress, people focus on the competence, expertise, and knowledge of the speaker, and during high stress, they focus on the person's ability to listen, to care, their empathy and compassion. Your communication strategies during the first 48 hours of a crisis situation are to be first, to be right, and to be credible. You want to acknowledge the situation that people find themselves in with empathy. Be empathetic. Then explain and inform people about the risk. Describe what you know, describe what you don't know, and tell them what you're doing to reduce your uncertainty and to find out the things that you don't know. Commit to continued communication and keep the communication channels open. Make sure that you have prepared your response tools prior to the crisis. The checklist, the contact list, the message map, the pre-scripted messages, your fact sheets, questions and answers, web pages, contact information for media, all of those things have to be done before the crisis hits. So we conclude as we began with these 3 messages from the CDC. During a crisis, you want to be first, be right, and be credible. If a crisis event occurred tomorrow, would you and your organization be prepared to do that?